Your life got better. So why didn't your body? You've done the work, you've tried the therapy, the breaks, the breathing, the phone-free weekends, and you still come back to the same place. Slightly tense, slightly braced, running a low-level readiness you can't name and can't put down, even when nothing, logically, is wrong. Most people call that stress. Some call it anxiety. Some just call it who you are. But there's a third possibility, and it lives in your nervous system, not your personality. It lives in a specific biological mechanism that almost no conversation about this experience ever actually reaches. That's what this is about. Developmental neuroscientist Dan Siegel introduced a concept called the window of tolerance. It's the zone within which your nervous system can process stress without flooding, becoming overwhelmed, reactive, unable to think clearly, or collapsing into shutdown and numbness. A regulated nervous system moves fluidly within this window. Something activates it. Your body responds. The threat resolves. The system returns to baseline. That's the cycle. That's what recovery looks like from the inside. But here's the thing. This window isn't fixed at birth. It gets built through repeated activation followed by genuine recovery. If that recovery consistently doesn't happen, if the next wave arrives before the last one fully resolved, the window narrows. And once it narrows enough, it tends to stay that way. If you were born between 1976 and 1985, your nervous system was under construction during a very specific sequence of events. The Cold War ended, but certainty didn't come with it. The 90s felt like optimism. Then you watched the Gulf War unfold in real time. You were 6 to 15, old enough to absorb the ambient anxiety of every adult around you, too young to name it. By your core developmental window, roughly ages 12 to 22, September 11th happened. The prefrontal cortex, which regulates fear response, was still being built. What that event wrote into your threat architecture wasn't just grief, it was a recalibration of what safe means. 7 years later, the 2008 financial crisis. Most Xennials were in their late 20s and early 30s, the years you're supposed to be building something stable. Instead, the floor dropped out. And then the pandemic in your late 30s and early 40s. This isn't a list of hard times. It's a neurological sequence. And the sequence matters more than the individual events do. Here's the piece that almost never gets discussed. There's a widespread assumption that repeated stress builds resilience, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. For certain kinds of stress, controllable, predictable, moderate, that's actually true. It's called stress inoculation. Graduated, manageable pressure can genuinely strengthen the stress response system. But the Xennial timeline doesn't describe controllable, predictable stress. It describes the opposite: sudden, uncontrollable, sequential, with no real recovery window between each wave. And that kind of stress doesn't toughen the nervous system. It lowers the threshold. This is called stress sensitization. The underlying mechanism, first documented by psychiatrist Robert Post at the National Institute of Mental Health and later expanded by neuroscientist Charles Nemeroff, is known in the research as the Kindling effect. This model, originally observed in neurological thresholds, shows that repeated stimulation can permanently shift the brain's firing point, not because the brain got weaker, but because the threshold permanently shifted. Post identified the same pattern in stress neuroscience. Repeated uncontrollable stress gradually lowers the firing threshold. What that means for you is this: after enough of these events, you don't need a major crisis to feel destabilized. A tense email, a shift in someone's tone, an unexpected change in plans, any of these can trigger a response that feels completely disproportionate to what just happened. That's not overreaction. That's not fragility. That's a lowered threshold, built by a specific sequence of events, not by weakness. And there's a meaningful difference between those two things. Stephen Porges, the neuroscientist behind polyvagal theory, introduced a concept called neuroception. It's your body's continuous, unconscious scan for cues of safety or threat. Before you've formed a single thought, your nervous system has already made its assessment. In a sensitized nervous system, that scan runs on an outdated threat model, so it reads ambiguous signals. A pause in a conversation, an unanswered message, a crowded room, not as neutral, but as potentially dangerous. And here's what makes this so disorienting. You know rationally that you're okay. You can list the reasons. You can think your way through it. But neuroception doesn't process logic. It processes pattern, and the pattern it learned said, things that feel fine have a way of not being fine. And there's one more layer, one that almost every conversation about this skips entirely. Research by neuroscientist A.D. Craig and cognitive neuroscientist Sarah Garfinkel at the University of Sussex has mapped what happens to interoception, the brain's capacity to sense its own internal state, under chronic stress. It gets blunted. You stop hearing the early signals, the chest that tightened an hour ago, the breath that got shallow during that phone call, the jaw that's been clenched since this morning. You're not ignoring these things. You genuinely can't hear them. That internal warning system turned down so gradually you didn't notice when it stopped working, which means by the time you register something's wrong, it's already been building. Your body was sending signals the whole time. The line just got too noisy. If you're watching this alongside the video in this series about burning out before anyone noticed, that one covers what this looks like from the outside. This one is about the body underneath. They run together. The link is in the description. And that leads us to the thing most advice about this gets completely wrong. Logic alone isn't enough to regulate a sensitized nervous system. Not because you're not trying, not because you're not self-aware, but because the stress response doesn't originate in the thinking brain. It originates in the limbic system, the amygdala, the brainstem, structures that exist below language, below reasoning, below the part of you that reads and understands and reflects. Peter Levine, the somatic therapist behind somatic experiencing, documented what he called incomplete stress responses. When the body prepares to respond and can't finish because the threat is chronic or ongoing or never fully resolved, the tension doesn't dissolve. It stays. It becomes the background hum you live inside. You can understand everything in this video and still feel exactly the same in your body afterward. That's not failure. That's neurobiology. And knowing that it's neurobiology changes what kind of work might actually help. So what does recovery actually look like for a nervous system that's been sensitized? Not going back to who you were before. The threshold doesn't reset because you decide it should, but it can widen, slowly, through the body, not through logic alone, through completing the stress responses your body was never allowed to finish, through repeated activation followed by genuine rest, through environments safe enough and consistent enough for the nervous system to begin revising its model. This isn't quick. It doesn't fit a productivity framework, and it doesn't require you to have been broken to pursue it. What you're working with isn't a damaged nervous system. It's a calibrated one, calibrated to a world that was, for a very specific sequence of years, genuinely unpredictable. The recalibration takes longer than the original calibration did. That's not a flaw in you. That's just how the system works. So, if you've spent years trying to feel better, trying to logic your way back to baseline, and still keep landing in that same place, now you have a more precise lens for what you're carrying. Not just anxiety, not just a personality that runs too hot. A sensitized nervous system with a narrowed window and a lowered threshold, built during a sequence of events that arrived before the system was finished. That's a different frame, and a different frame opens up a different kind of work. There are other videos in this series exploring this experience from different angles. The distrust that isn't cynicism, the burnout that never announced itself, the exhaustion of carrying two eras at once. They're in the description if you want to keep going. Thank you for watching, and as always, you matter.